Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on aluminum and electrical wiring. You're going to learn a lot today, and a recording of this presentation will be available in the next couple of days. Now we'll jump right into our presentation. Please welcome Brian Cook from PowerCheck.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for being interested in this topic of wiring of old houses. This particular talk is about the years 1960 to 1975. The first talk was about up till 1960, which was the knob and tube years and the ungrounded wiring years. A number of you were saying, well, what about aluminum wire? So I put this talk together to address this whole new era of wiring that took place around 1960. And it's really, really interesting. You can see the development. As we know, aluminum wire, excuse me, as we know, knob and tube wiring was intended for houses for the lighting of outlets. Sorry, what am I saying here? Let's start again. Here, I'll just get this all set up. There we are. Okay, knob and tube was 1910 till about 1950, and that was replaced in houses from 1950 to 1960 with ungrounded wiring, basically knob and tube in a jacket. All of this lighting, all of these electrical outlets were designed for lighting. Lighting was what electricity was for. That was it. But what happened in 1958 was we had the development of kitchen counter appliances. Kitchen counter appliances were made out of metal. Waffle irons, toasters, kettles, this kind of stuff, electric frying pans. This was different application for electricity than lighting. Lighting didn't need grounding. It was two-prong outlets throughout the house for lighting. What happened in 1958 was the introduction, or the late 50s, was the introduction of kitchen counter appliances. Because the kitchen counter appliances had were made out of metal, there needed to be protection of the metal. In some way, should an electrical wire make contact with the metal chassis. The wires melt from overheating, the live wire touches the chassis, boom, there'll be sparks. And we want to have it so that the breaker will trip. The way this was done is by the addition of a ground wire. That's the colloquial term, ground wire. It's actually correctly called a bonding conductor. Anyway, the bonding conductor is a third wire that goes back to the panel. Now, we call it grounding. Grounding was nothing new. It was used for the wiring of stoves, electric ranges back in the 40s, the 50s. It was nothing new, but outlets were not grounded. So in 1958, they added to the code, in addition to all of your ungrounded outlets throughout the house, install one outlet in the kitchen counter, a grounded wire, a grounded outlet with ground wire going back to the panel. So they developed a new wire. It was called NMD3, and it was the third in the series. And the reason it's called NMD3 is it had a third conductor inside the inside the wire, which was your bonding conductor going back to the panel. Anyway, now we've got an outlet in the kitchen, which is grounded. The rest of the house was still wired with knob and tube or ungrounded cable. It was fine. But it was a bit kind of awkward, two different types of wire for electricians. So they just bought NMD3 and wired the entire house, starting in around 1958 with NMD3 modern grounded wire. In 1962, so after 1958, it's rare to see houses wired with any knob and tube or ungrounded wiring. It can happen, but by 1958, people were wiring the kitchen with grounded wiring and also the rest of the house. But 1962, it became code that the entire house now has to be with grounded outlets, including the kitchen, of course. And I think the reason was what we see in the early 60s was that now we have the introduction of electric baseboard electric heaters that were plug in these, they're on wheels and you roll them around, electric radiators. And people would bring them into the dining room and into the living room. And they were made out of metal. And they came out in the late 50s and they needed grounding as well. So that's why they said in 1962, the whole darn house should have grounded outlets. Grounded outlets were 3-prong outlets versus the old-fashioned 2-prong. Houses prior to the 60s, the wiring was done with soldered connections and crimped connections that took a lot of time, and people were scared of electricity, and they wanted to do it right. And it's rare to find problems with the connections in these houses in the late 50s. Anyway, that technique rolled over throughout the early 60s of connections being crimped and soldered rather than just with wire connectors. So houses built between 1960 and 1965 were exemplary. My own house was built in 1964. And I'll tell you, when I bought the house, I didn't check the electrical but now that I've taken it, it's all soldered connections, just like they did in the knob and tube days, and extraordinarily robust, going to 3-prong outlets. So this was the houses built in that period, 1960 and 1965, were excellent. It was modern 3-conductor wire with the grounding, going to soldered connections and soldered splices inside the outlet boxes. What happened in 1965? It's really interesting, actually. I've done a bit of research as to how this happened. Everything was copper wiring, brass screws, which is 99% copper. Everything was copper-based. The whole electrical industry from 1910 right through to 1965. What happened in 1965 was what happened in the early 1960s was the Vietnam War. Well, the Vietnam War needed lots of bullets made out of copper. So the price of copper went up. It went up, someone said it went up 3 times what it used to be. It was totally expensive. So instead of being like $5,000 to wire a house in today's money, all of for wire, all of a sudden it's $15,000. It's very expensive. It's gone up 3-fold the price of electrical wire to wire a house with copper. And it was due to the Vietnam War for copper bullets, if you can believe it. Anyway, as atrocious as that is, that whole scenario, the electrical industry had to find solutions. So aluminum was a solution. In 1964, 1965, it was introduced into the Canadian Electrical Code as a solution, as an alternative to copper. Aluminum had been used, or has been used, ever since electricity began, throughout the exterior world of electricity. The wires that come from the Peace River Dam are all aluminum. The wires that go from the local substation to your telephone pole are all aluminum. The wires that go from the telephone pole to your house are all aluminum. Is aluminum a problem? No, of course not. Aluminum's got huge advantages in external wiring. It's lightweight compared to copper. It's a lot less expensive. The disadvantage, the two big disadvantages to aluminum is you have to upsize the wire slightly because its internal resistance is slightly less than that of copper. So to combat the higher resistance of copper, you increase the wire size. Aluminum is required for your outlets to use a number 12 gauge conductor, which is one size bigger than number 14, which is what you use for copper. The resistivity per meter of aluminum number 12 is identical to that of, well, within 3 significant figures, to that of copper number 14 gauge. So no concerns with resistance of the wire, so long as you use the other, you use the number 12 instead of the number 14 gauge. No concerns. The second problem with aluminum, it's not really a problem, it's just something to be recognized, is you have to use proper connectors that are designed for aluminum, which in the outside world, that's the way it's done, and it's zero concerns. So in 1964, 1965, they allowed aluminum to be used as a solution. Instead of stopping at the bringing it into the, well, they always allowed it from the house to the, from the house top of the masthead into the panel to bring the power, the 100 amps or whatever it is, into the main disconnect, the main shutoff for your house. But in the early 60s, they allowed it to be used for branch circuit wiring. Branch circuit wiring means the wiring that comes from the panel to your outlets, to your lights. Not a problem, so long as you use the proper connectors. Easy, easy peasy. Let's go on and take a look at the slides here. I think it's really, really important, if we're talking about aluminum wire, to really understand its relative risk with relation to everything else. This data, unfortunately, I don't know how to get modern data. Very fortunately, I managed to get this data in 2010. I contacted the BC Office of Fire Commissioner, and they sent me, which was fantastic, all of the data for house fires that had occurred going back from 2007. And I plotted these fire data on Excel graph. And the graph was a line that got a little bit higher in age, but it didn't really, it was kind of a graph that didn't really say anything. But I was thinking about this graph and I was saying, the problem with this graph is it doesn't take into account the number of occupied homes today that are from different eras. Like there's a lot more houses from the 80s existing today than there is from the 1930s. So therefore, where's the relative relationship with fire risk? So I phoned up the StatsCan, the 1-800 number StatsCan, and I asked them for data on BC number of construction builds per decade from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all the way up to 2000. They were absolutely fantastic. The guys, they just totally, I guess I got a good librarian down there that was very interested. And he sent me all the data for the number of house constructions at different data of different decades. And so then I took those fire numbers from the Office of the Fire Commissioner and I divided them by the number of houses built of those decades to find out the relative risk, the number of fires per 100,000 houses of that decade. Pressed enter, and boom, this is the graph we got. It was a straight line increasing with age of house, right from 2007 going up. Isn't that interesting? It goes and then it levels off at 1950, no increase in houses built 1950, which was post knob and tube, or at the tail end of knob and tube, back to 1910 per 100,000 houses. So there's no increase in risk of fire in 1910 to 1950. And the risk drops down as we get to newer and newer houses. So I was just absolutely thrilled with this graph. And I sent this to all the insurance companies saying, look, guys, we should not be basing risk on, is there knob and tube? Is there aluminum? Because we see risk of electrical fire of a specific house is really a function of age, AGE, exclamation mark. That's the key indicator of fire risk. There it is. There's the data. If we look at houses with a secondary suite, we see there's an increase. That increases proportionally with age as well. Anyway, moving on. So I just wanted to put this into perspective because I think this is important. Houses with the knob and tube, yes, they're more dangerous based on age as we get newer. Houses with aluminum wire from 1965 to 1975, yes. But what's the real cause of these fires? Number one, lack of maintenance, deterioration. Number two, DIY work. Number three, occupant actions. This particular house is a photograph that I took. We're going to go back and look at these three items. So you see, it's not about knob and tube per se. It's about age of house. So let's look at those three things. Lack of maintenance, DIY work, and occupant actions. Why? Very simple. Why is that a function of age? Very simple. As houses get older, debris in boxes increases. This is a 1965 installation. you can tell because it's got the Bakelite box, that black Bakelite box. They came out early 60s and they were used till about late mid 1970s. Full of debris. People say, oh, so what? Well, what's debris made out of? It's organic material, spider webs. Spider webs are just rampant in older houses, in the boxes. Sometimes you can't even see the wires. Well, you can barely see it in this. Sometimes you cannot see. I've been in panels where you take off the panel cover and you cannot see the wires. You see a mat about ½ inch thick. A mat, just like a felt mat, covering up the breakers of spider webs. Spiders are all gone. Sometimes they're still there, but usually they're gone. It's just old dead spider webs. No sparks, no fire. But what's that spider web stuff and debris made out of? It's organic material, just like dryer fluff. Organic material that's getting drier and drier and drier. As the house ages, it gets drier and drier and more and more. No sparks, no fire. But if there's a little spark from a loose wire, house fire, just like that. What's the repair action? Taking off the cover plate. We say do this every 10 years. Take off the cover plate, get a vacuum cleaner with a plastic nozzle and suck out the debris. You'll be surprised. Basements are always full. Garages, forget about it. They are not just full, they're stuffed with debris if they're built in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Absolutely stuffed because they get in through the holes, the tiny little holes. By the way, this is why it says in the code, no holes greater than 1/4 inch in your electrical boxes. If there's a hole bigger than like a knockout, you got to put a knockout filler in. And you see it all the time in DIY installations where people don't put knockout fillers, and then you get more spider webs in the boxes. Anyway, you can see the problem. And this is why I think it's so important to talk about what are the real problems, what causes the fires. It's so easy to fix this. As a matter of fact, I talked with an electrical contractor who's been doing this stuff for 50 years, and Al Horvath, and I said, how do you clean the boxes? And he says, use a Slurpee straw. Get a Slurpee straw and you blow. And he says, done. And he says, put down a towel beneath the outlet before you blow, and it gets it all out. And but it's regular maintenance. That's what it takes. So moving right along. DIY work. DIY work increases with age of house. The real reason why there's DIY work is because there wasn't enough outlets or lights or what have you installed at time of construction. When houses were first built in 1910, 1920, 1930, the code said, well, 1927 was the first Canadian electrical code. 1920s, 1927 through said 1 outlet in each room. No outlet required in a walk-in closet. 1 outlet in each room. Why? A 2-prong outlet for lighting. 1 outlet in a kitchen for lighting. As the code progressed, more outlets were added. So as the houses get built later, they got more electrical stuff added at time of construction. The big year was 1972, and I've got the details here. In 1972, there was minimum 100 amp service was required for the potential of basement suites being built where we needed more power. In 1972, we had a lot of revisions to the code requiring more outlets in the house. So the real reason for DIY, do-it-yourself work, it means installations that were not done safely. You can look at them and say it was done by a handyman who didn't know the electrical code. That's what we call DIY work. The real reason for DIY work was we needed a second outlet in the bedroom. We needed a baseboard heater in the bedroom. We needed a renovation in the basement. We're turning the rec room, which had no outlets, the basement returning it into a suite. We need a dryer. We bought this new dryer in 1960s, and we need to have a dryer installed. Now, if all of these installations were done by licensed electrical contractors under permit, as the law requires, would there be any problems? Of course not. No. But that ain't the case. We see, personally, I've done around 2,000 inspections with PowerCheck. And in about 80% of the houses I've seen, there was an illegal basement suite. 80%. And I was talking with some people from the city, and they were saying similar numbers. These houses all have got basement suites that are illegal. This is the kind of stuff. When you're doing an illegal basement suite, you can't phone up a big electrical contractor like Mod Electric or Hula Electric or, any of the big electrical companies, because they don't want to touch it unless there's a permit pulled, unless it's done properly. So people resort to, hey, I got a neighbor who can do it, or go to the classified and find someone for $25 an hour who's going to wire my basement suite. And they don't try and do something illegal or something wrong. They think they know what they're doing, but they don't. They don't know about grounding. They don't know about proper connections. They don't know about electrical boxes. They don't know about proper wire size. They don't know about proper breakers and all the stuff that you learn as an electrician. And as a result, they make mistakes. And as a result, DIY work is rampant in older houses, increasing with age. DIY work, lack of maintenance, buildup of spider webs, and occupant actions are what cause fires. Here's another. Do you believe this, eh? They stuck in three separate, look at that. 3 separate wires through 3 different holes, which means the connections are outside the box. I mean, it's just phenomenal that there ain't more fires. By the way, it's about 1 in 10,000 houses has a reported electrical fire. I think that's the number, but don't quote me on that. I actually do have numbers for a number of electrical fires somewhere here, which I should have gotten. But yeah. Electrical fires, I don't have the statistics available from the BC Office of the Fire Commissioner if you're interested in the statistics of electrical fires. Anyway, DIY is rampant in these old houses, and it's surprising that half this town doesn't burn down. Maintenance, receptacle deterioration. You ever seen these outlets? You put in a plug and it just falls out, or almost falls out. Code says you got to have an outlet. It has to withhold 13 newtons of pressure for 1 minute to be called an acceptable outlet. 13 newtons is about 3 pounds, which means you have to be able to pull with 3 pounds of force, and it doesn't come out and hold it for 1 minute. The outlet has to hold. You've been in these outlets, 1/4 of a pound, and the outlet, the plug falls out. They're all worn out as they get old. and not all of them, the ones that are used a lot. The brass loses its springiness, and then it doesn't hold it anymore. Well, that's where you get sparks because of the bad connection. You get sparks. Once you get sparks, that's how you get melting. And once you get melting, that's how you get fire. And if there's debris in the boxes, so again, maintenance. That's the key. Maintenance, checking the outlets, changing the outlets, cleaning the boxes. But we still have to address this DIY stuff. In 1965, aluminum wire became developed, and we know why, as an option for wiring of branch circuits, taking power from the panel and taking it to the outlets. It was a lot cheaper. As a result, if your house was built between 1965 and 1975, it's most likely it was wired with aluminum. When they talk about wired with aluminum, they're not talking about the wires coming from the street to the house. They're not talking about the wires from the masthead outside your house down into the front panel, because those have been aluminum. That's a 50-50, whether it's aluminum or copper, ever since time began. The main feeders. But when we talk about aluminum wiring per se, what we mean is the wiring that goes from the panel to your outlets. It was allowed, 1965, to be used as an alternative to copper due to the price of copper. At the time, outlets were made out of materials, all sorts of stuff, plastic and bakelite, but the connection part of the outlets was made of brass. Well, brass and copper work fantastically well together, causing no concerns. Well, not no concerns, but minimal concerns. Brass and aluminum cause no concern, again, minimal concerns. Wasn't a problem because aluminum went onto outlets that with brass screws. The wire connectors that were used, if you held up a wire connector from the 1960s, they were usually the black ones they were black, and they were made out of porcelain, and they had a spring inside made of brass. Wonderful, 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 wonderful. Were there any problems? I don't want to say no, because there is a problem, and that's due to cold creep, which we can talk about, but minimal problems. As with copper, the primary problems arose when people changed the outlets. These outlets were all ivory, and by 1970, we had the introduction of modern Decora outlets. Modern Decora is what everybody has today. It's the rectangle ones that are white, and they are everywhere. They took the world by storm. Power check, we've done over 2,000 houses with aluminum wiring inspections. I personally have done around 200 houses that are wired with aluminum. In every single house I have seen, except for one, and that was a lady in Musqueam, who had a First Nations house where it was like stepping back into 1965, which was phenomenal. Her house was perfect. No DIY, no anything. She hadn't changed the outlets. They were worn out and needed a bit of replacing, but the original outlets with brass screws. In every other house, 199 out of 200 houses, people have swapped the aluminum rated outlets with brass screws for modern decorums. Every single one in the kitchens. Forget it. Nobody has the old outlets anymore. The aluminum conductors are not rated. Excuse me, the aluminum outlets are not rated to be installed on aluminum conductors. Nor are the modern wire connectors. I can talk about this for a minute. In 1970, what happened was, hey, the price of copper is so expensive, even for making little springs to go inside. The wire connectors. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about the details. I would love to talk about the details because maybe there's some people here that are interested. And I'll quickly talk about it, and it's so clear. As I said, up until 1970, all the wire connectors had brass springs. Here's a couple of, for people that are technical, a couple of numbers that you might find interesting. It's got to do with the coefficient of expansion as a function of temperature. As temperature increases, metals expand. As temperatures decrease, metals shrink. It's called the coefficient of expansion, how much it expands. The coefficient of expansion for aluminum is around 20 micrometers per meter of length. It means it'll expand 20 per degree centigrade. It'll expand just a little tiny bit, 20 times 10 to the minus 6 meters per degree centigrade. The coefficient of brass is 19. The coefficient of copper wire is 18. So you can see brass is a perfect metal for both copper and aluminum, as the coefficient of expansion is very, very similar. It means that every day it heats up 2 or 3 or 10 degrees, and it cools down 2 or 3 or 10 degrees at night. So it's expanding, contracting, expanding and contracting. Well, if you have an aluminum wire underneath a brass screw, the two expand together as the day gets hotter and contract together as the day gets cooler, as nighttime falls. And it does this again and again and again and again and again and again. The connections stay pretty tight. They're not identical in expansion coefficients, but they're very similar. Whether it's aluminum to brass or whether it's copper to brass, connections work. But you know, the price of copper is darn expensive for making springs. So around 1970, Thomas and Betts, who makes the wire connectors, who termed the word Moret, comes from Thomas and Betts, who made the same wire connectors, said, look, guys, copper is awfully expensive. We don't really need it for copper wiring, copper springs. We don't really need to have brass inserts. Let's use steel springs. Steel's got a coefficient of around 17. Depends on the steel. Some steel is like, I was looking it up, it's like 11, which is very, very little. But it goes up to about 17, which is very, very similar to that of copper. So you look at 17 to 18 for the copper. Very, very close compatibility. So, hey, we don't need to use brass for copper wiring. We can use steel. The coefficients of expansion are very, very similar. So they came up with a whole new way of doing things. They said, they call it the 30 series. The 30 series wire connectors have steel springs. They said, if you're using copper wire, which everybody does nowadays, well, this was the early 70s, if you're using copper wire, use the 30 series wire connectors. They're color coded depending on the number of wires you can put in: orange, yellow, blue, black. So people, and it's for copper, steel springs. But if you're wiring your house with aluminum, use the 60 series. The 60 series was either a 63 or a 65. And that meant that you could put 3 wires or up to 5 wires under one connector, which actually, of number 14 gauge. If you're using aluminum, you actually have to downgrade it. So it's actually 2 and up to 4. So 2 wires of aluminum, yeah, you can use aluminum and a copper, you've got to use a 63, or you can use a 63 or 65. Anyway, the 60 series wire connectors, and they actually, it's not brass, it's bronze. They used a bronze spring. The other thing about the 60 series wire connectors, instead of being made out of plastic, the plastic ones are rated for 105 degrees centigrade. The 60 series are made out of bakelite, hard plastic, rated for 125 degrees centigrade. So if there is any extra heat because of any kind of quality and connection, you've got a bit of coverage there. That's why they are a lot more expensive, like 5 times the price. Really expensive. I don't know if it's 5 times the price, but they're a lot more expensive. Some people say they're like 50 cents each, versus you get a box of 100 for $10. So of the standard copper ones. Anyway, we're going a bit too technical here. To make things simple, you got to use the right wire connectors. If you use the right wire connectors on aluminum, and you use outlets that are rated for aluminum, no concerns with aluminum wiring above and beyond that of copper. Here we have examples. This was taken by a friend of mine who was in a house and sent me some photos. Again, you can see the bakelite box, 1960s installation. A red wire connector, not rated for aluminum. You can see the aluminum wire, and look what happened. Boom, fire. Before we go on to voltage drop, just want to say the solution that people talk about is pigtailing. Pigtailing is a terrific solution. Remember, we talked about the problem with aluminum is you cannot go to modern Decora outlets. Everybody wants modern Decora outlets. So what do? Now you can actually, in the last 10 years, they do make now, Leviton does make Decora style outlets rated for aluminum. So you can buy them, and they are with the brass screws that are compatible with aluminum. No concerns. They're very expensive, and I don't know what they cost, but they're quite dear. The solution, alternate solution, is pigtailing. Pigtailing is a word that just means you take the aluminum wire that comes into your box, and rather than hooking it directly onto the outlet, you attach a little tiny piece of wire called a pig's tail. Maybe 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches long, made of copper. and you splice the aluminum wire onto the modern little copper pigtail. And the copper pigtail goes to your modern Decora outlets. No concerns. The thing is, you have to, HAVE in capital letters, use the 60 series wire connectors. Or you've just moved the fire point from the outlet to 2 inches away to the connection, as we can see here. I have been in about 200 houses. In about 100 of those, people have said, oh, I don't need power check. I've already had my house pigtailed. My insurance company is fine. I told them it's pigtailed. And for some reason, some smart person said, look, get it checked anyway. We want to have a report that it's confirmed pigtailed properly. Well, go in there and literally 50% of the 100 houses have got what you see here. Wrong wire connectors on aluminum pigtail splices. I was in one house in West Vancouver where the top floor was all done with the correct with the correct 60 series wire connectors, and the bottom floor was done with the yellow number 33 wire connectors. I couldn't believe it, and I don't know how that happened. The top floor was perfect, all spliced with the 60 series. Maybe they ran out and didn't understand the difference between the 2 wire connectors. I don't know, but I thought that was quite funny. Top floor was fine. Bottom floor was all spliced wrong, with the wrong wire connectors. What's the fix? Go and buy a bucket of 65 wire connectors and just go through and change all those wire connectors from the 30 series to the 60 series, and Bob's your uncle. You're in and out in 2 hours. So that's the fix. You have to do that. Again, I would call this DIY work. This is DIY, means it's an installation not done correctly. No intention of doing things incorrectly. I remember I got a call once from a contractor in Vernon saying, oh, what's all this number 63? I got a perfect solution, he said. He says, I used the 33 wire connectors with a little bit of Penetrox, which is the antioxidant paste. Works fine. Accepted by the inspector. Nonsense. It's not accepted. It says in the code you cannot use the 33s. Antioxidant paste is a totally different thing. That's to keep water away from the connections. It's got nothing to do with the expansion and contraction. You have to use the correct wire connectors. And it's incredible how many electricians and how many people don't know this. Anyway, it's super easy to identify if you've got loose connections. It's called voltage drop testing. This is actually a test that's been in the code forever. It's a standard it's not the electrical code, it's with CSA standards, Z32, and it's for hospital patient care areas. The CSA standard is how to check regular maintenance, is what they do in emergency rooms and all that stuff, to make sure the connections are perfect. What you do is you measure the voltage at the panel and you measure the voltage at the outlet under a load of 80% the rating of the outlet, which is 12 amps at the outlet. So what we do is we measure the voltage at the panel, which is at the outlet without a load connection. You're going to get the same value. So here we got 119. Turn on a 12 amp load. I brought along a little electric hair dryer, and it drops from 119 to 114. It should drop no more than 1 volt per 10 feet of wire run. And I'm being very simplistic. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We've got to take into account the voltage drop across the breakers. And it should drop, in theory, 0.7 volts on aluminum wire. And for copper, aluminum number 12 or copper number 14 should drop 0.7 volts per 10 feet, per 10 feet of wire run. So you got to guess the distance a little bit, but mid-house, kitchen, living room, this area, mid-house, we expect the voltage to be 2 volts, 3 volts drop, maybe 4 volts. Here we see a 5-volt drop, indicating a little bit loose. I'll tell you something. This test works like a hot darn. I go to some outlets mid-house and it drops 8 volts. One house, it went from 120 down to 108, a 12-volt drop. What does that mean? It means there's lots of loose connections. And I went and opened the boxes, and sure enough, what do we see? Number 33 wire connectors on pigtail splices of aluminum. What's the fix? I had a friend, an electrician, who went by, changed the wire connectors from 33s up to the 65, the proper wire connectors. The voltage drop fell right into spec, getting a 3-volt drop, 3-volt forge volt drop, maximum 5-volt drop at the end of line down in the far bedroom. Simple fix. The third thing we didn't really talk about is occupant actions. Occupant actions, you know, you can go on and on about this stuff. There's nothing we can do after we leave. It's up to the occupant, except getting education out there somehow. But you know, so many of the electrical fires that we read about are due to occupants doing stupid stuff. I shouldn't say stupid, doing stuff that is causing a high risk of fire, and they're not aware of it. Samples that I see all the time are electric baseboard heaters, in addition to DIY stuff. But people put bookcases, or they put in the basement suite. They put believe it or not, they have an electric baseboard heater, and they push their bed up underneath the baseboard, over. They say, it's got legs and stuff, so it's a little bit higher. But then the bedding falls down and lies on top of the heater, and you get a fire. I was in one house where the guy actually had a bookcase, a wooden bookcase, over the baseboard heater. I mean, they're limited space in these basement suites, so they were doing the best they could. But he had a stack of magazines and newspapers on the first layer of the bookcase, on the first shelf of the bookcase. And he actually literally had papers that were no more than an inch away from the baseboard heater. And the newspapers, and they were brown, that dark brown, like the moment before it goes on fire. And I was there because of knob and tube. It ain't about the knob and tube, it's about because of the fire hazard from the papers hanging on the hanging over the baseboard heaters. But occupant action, another action we see all the time is Christmas lights installed around the exterior of the house with a staple gun. People say, what's the problem? Why is there a huge increase in fires at Christmas time? Because of this. What's a staple made out of? Metal. Well, the metal's putting pressure on the 2 wires covered in a soft plastic. And the pressure, over the years, that soft plastic breaks down and you get a crack. And then you get a direct contact from the metal staple between the line conductor and the neutral. And that's when you have a spark. So you've got a fire hazard there, times 50 staples. It's true. Extension cords stapled to walls. In the posher houses, people don't like them lying around. They'll staple them onto the wall or onto the baseboard molding. Same problem. I say, get rid of the staples, and then it's fine. So occupant actions. You read in the newspaper about, I read a horrific story of a whole apartment burned down in New York, and it was due to somebody had a space heater. And they went to sleep at night, and the space heater somehow tipped over. I think they kept the wind open or something. Anyway, it didn't trip. So I think some of them have got a disconnect, and the disconnect should turn it off when it tips over. Anyway, this didn't tip over, and the apartment building, like 10 people died, because of a occupant action. So that's a huge part of it as well. I think the message behind all of this is really risk is a function of age of home. Aluminum wire certainly is of concern, but if aluminum wire is addressed properly, it's of little concern. The one thing we didn't talk about is in maintenance is the importance of regularly having, like every 10 years, have an electrician come through and snug up the connections. Whether it's aluminum or whether it's copper, connections do get loose over time. The physics behind it, it's a property called cold creep. That's the term. It means that the metal creeps out from underneath the pressure. If you have a screw holding down a wire or holding down anything, if holding down a wire is a good example on an outlet, there's pressure. Now, metals are a homogeneous mix of molecules which will flow. They flow to relieve the pressure of the metal flowing outwards. So if you have a screw going down on metal and you have it there, whether it's a copper connector or aluminum connector, after 20 years of pressure being pushed on it, the metal will flow. The speed of flow is a function of the melting point of the metal. Aluminum is a softer metal than copper. It melts at a lower temperature. And copper is a lower temperature than that of steel. But even steel to steel, big screws on the bridges, they get loose as well, but it takes longer. Say it takes about 10 years for this anecdotal information, but this is what people talk about. 10 years for aluminum connectors to get connections to get a bit loose, quarter turn loose. Once they get to a quarter turn loose, it kind of stops getting more loose because the pressure is now less, but the metal flows out. Aluminum with a steel screw on top of it, excuse me, yeah, with a steel screw, it's going to flow out. And every 10 years, you need to get somebody in, tighten up the connections, tighten up the wire connectors. Doesn't take long, takes an hour to do a panel and check for the connections, and a couple of hours to do the rest of the house. Copper, we go into copper panels. Every single house built pre-1975, you go into those houses and every screw in the panel, guaranteed, is all a quarter turn loose. And we go through and we do our inspection, give them all a snug up the screws on the panel. And it's good again for another 20 years if it's copper. But again, we talked about sparks. We need to eliminate those sparks, and sparks happen because of loose connections. Again, the wire connectors, the 63s or the 33s, whatever you're using, you got to use the white wire connectors and you got to snug up the connections. So again, that's maintenance. But in summary, if a house is well maintained with regular maintenance, you got aluminum wire, you got copper wire, proper wire connectors, clean away the dust and debris, make sure there's no DIY. And if you do have DIY, get an electrical contractor in to go through the place and fix up the DIY correctly. Then there's no reason that these old houses can't remain wonderful, solid, and safe for many, many more years. So that being said, folks, I don't really have anything more to say. So why don't I open it up for questions?
Thank you, Brian, for all of your information. That was wonderful. We do have some questions that have been coming in. We'll start with the one from Anita. Um, Anita's saying, today the cost of copper has risen greatly over the years. Is there another alternative to be used for the future?
What a great question. Yeah, you know what's happening? If I could, I mean, lots of people are trying to find solutions. I think we're looking, the immediate future, I don't think there's too many changes, but what we're seeing now is what's been taking place in Europe. And I without question, we're seeing, how can I make this simple in one sentence? High current applications, your waffle iron, your stove, your kettle, your frying pan, they're running 12 amps, 10 amps, 12 amps. They need solid electrical copper wires rated for these numbers. But what we're seeing so much of nowadays is we're seeing chargers, USB. I just bought an electric toothbrush recently, and it's you know, the power cable for the electric toothbrush is not a socket with a plug. It's a USB connector, and then it comes with a module that you plug into the outlet that gives you 5 volts USB output to charge your electric toothbrush. That's fantastic. I can envisage what they do in Europe. I actually spent quite a bit of time in Germany. And what they do in outlets and lights, and even see more of it in lights, is they'll run high power wires to the switch or to a junction box, like the regular wires, but then they'll run thin wires to they'll have a fuse in the junction box, a little 1 amp fuse, and then they'll run thin wires from the 1 amp fuse to the vanity lights in the LED vanity lights in the bathroom. So it means you're cutting down the wire from a heavy wire. Instead of going all the way and running through the lighting, it's only running to the switch. And in the switch, there's a little plug-in 1 amp fuse. And then they're running 1 amp wire, which is extremely thin. Little cable the size of your USB cable, running from your light switch to your vanity light. And that's cutting down on wire. I see much more of that. I was in Portugal recently, and in Portugal, what they're doing is they're running high power wires up to the junction box, and they're having sensors inside the and then the light fixture. But between the light fixture and I guess it's inside the light fixture is a sensor, and it's a radio signal. You've got a thin wire going to the switch, just and when you hit the switch, it sends a little radio signal to the light to turn on. I think it's called smart homes, smart electronics. And with that switch, you can do anything you want. You can have it programmable, turn on, you can send signals to turn on different LED colors and everything else. But it means you're cutting down on wire. Instead of running wires all the way from the, throughout the whole house to the switches and everything else, you're cutting down, 50% of your wire. So there's all sorts of things like that. Smart homes, using micro switches, small fuses inside outlets. That's where I see things going. And going to low voltage. There's a professor at UBC who's actually specializing in future homes. And what he sees is we're going to 12 volts. 12-volt systems, DC, which is basically batteries, car batteries. And of course, we're never going to get rid of the 120-volt systems going to your high current items like toasters and kettles and stuff. But for the rest of the house, there's no reason we can't go 12 volts DC for the lighting. And that cuts down wire. That cuts down wire dramatically, wire size. Now you can wire the whole place. Plus, it's electrically safe. Current-wise, the sparks that you're going to be getting from 12 volts are fractionally small. I think that's the future, especially as we see solar panels becoming more and more available and on people's roofs, because solar panels put out DC. Again, that's a perfect compatibility for 12-volt systems, rather than having to go to an inverter to change it to 120 volts AC and run it through the house. We're going to be going to 12-volt systems at some time in the future with solar cells and perhaps complementing the power, and small fuses, smart homes with switches controlling by RC. Smoke alarms. Smoke alarms. You can now buy smoke alarms that are RC RF. Or not RC, RF. Radio frequency interconnect between the alarms. So instead of wiring big heavy gauge wire from your panel, from your outlet in your basement to your first floor, to your second floor, to your third floor, you can just pick up power from a nearby outlet for your smoke alarm, and they're radio frequency controlled. So when one goes off, they all go off. And that's now on the market for the last 4 or 5 years. So combination of these things is the future. Very interesting stuff.
That would be amazing. That's
Yeah.
Before we get into anything else, Doug has a perfect example, perfect time for you to mention Power Check. And he says, do you have Power Check workers out in the Lower Mainland area and Vancouver Island as an example?
Oh, thank you for the question. Yes, yes, yes. I started Power Check in 2006 and became incorporated in 2007. The requirement was, I proposed this, it was actually BCAA that picked it up and said, what a great idea. But we've got 32 locations throughout BC. We need, in order to go forward with marketing Power Check, we need to have 32 inspectors, one guy wherever there's a BCAA location. So I was busy for 6 months running around BC by airplane and taxi and boat and everything else, setting up and training inspectors. And I got 32 guys set up. And we have most of those guys still working today, still busy. Got a guy in Victoria, got a guy in Nanaimo. We had a fellow in Courtenay, who I don't know if he's still doing it. So that's the island. In the Lower Mainland, we've got 3 guys who handle the Fraser Valley up to Hope. And in Vancouver, got 2 guys who handle Vancouver, and then everywhere else in the interior, Okanagan, got a guy in Kelowna, a guy in Penticton, guy in Vernon, guy in Kamloops, guy in Quesnel, guy in Prince George, guy in Prince Rupert. It's been a job trying to keep these guys. The special thing about trying to get Power Check inspectors, and this is the real challenge, my whole focus of Power Check was, let's have an independent evaluator, independent guy who's not going to try and get work. He's there just to, he's there just to give you an accurate description of what needs to be done, if anything, to get this house to the safety standards of the time of installation, and then recommendations for which we call medium risk, and then low risk says not only medium, but a few upgrades have been done to bring the house to the safety standards of 2001. Anyway, but the real challenge is trying to find inspectors, guys who don't want to do the repairs, who just there to do the thorough examination. I require that everyone who does a Power Check examination is a master electrician, not just a journeyman with red seal. got to go back to school and do the master's program. It's called FSR Class B. Do the exam to become a master. And the reason I say that is I did the master's exam in 1995, and I went back to school, which you have to do, back to BCIT for a term. And I learned so much at that time about code compliance, and that's been so helpful in identification of what's wrong. Like we're talking about wire connectors. We learn all that in this master's program. So for that reason, I think the person who does the exam must be the master electrician. Must. And it's a requirement. I get guys phoning me all the time saying they're red seals and they live in Seashell. I'm sorry, you cannot work for PowerCheck unless you get the master's ticket. It's so valuable, that extra education. The second problem we have is that most of these guys are contractors. That's how they make their living. And we don't want them. We want the report to be independent so the homeowner can choose whoever they want to do the work. PowerCheck makes not 1 penny from any repairs that may result. We solely make our 100% of our income from the inspection alone. And it has to be that way. So what we've allowed is I allow the guys to say, okay, you have to present to the homeowner a PowerCheck report with the required actions to get down to low risk, but you must tell them that they're welcome to choose any licensed electrical contractor of their choice to go from the house today to get down to medium risk or down to low risk. You must tell them that. And if they want to hire you or ask you for a quote, well, that's fair enough. They can ask you. And you know, the guys I've got all are like that. You know, it's taken a lot of work. It's really taken a lot of education and a lot of with the guys, and a lot of, you know, some guys haven't worked out, and clients have complained that this guy was trying to do the work, and so the guy gets no more work from PowerCheck and we get someone else. And you know, we've had a dozen guys through the system over the years that we've had to say it's not right for you. But you know, I think the team we've got now, the guys we've got set up, are really straight shooters because the clients have not complained at all. And you know, many of them are retired licensed electrical contractors who are in their 60s. They've worked their whole life. They know code inside out, and they want something to do on a weekend or a couple of hours one afternoon. And they, you know, we'll send them out, and the homeowners are just really happy to have these guys in their house. It's like having your grandfather come over, and he's an old master electrician, to tell you what needs to be done. I tell them, they said, well, how do we decide on things that we're kind of on the fence about? Like, should you put in a new panel or should you just change the circuit breakers? I say one sentence. I say, imagine that homeowner is your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, who's bought an old house and they want to live in it safely. Maybe they've got a family coming. What would you tell them to do? That's what should go on the PowerCheck report. Nothing more, nothing less. And
That's perfect.
that's it. And it's working.
I'm glad that that's working for you and your team.
Thank you.
We'll get a couple more questions in. Doug's also asking, what about aluminum paste for connecting aluminum wiring to a non-compatible connection or outlet? I heard this as a solution before.
Okay. Oh, there's a whole nother discussion, but I'll try and be really quick. Aluminum paste is required for stranded electrical connections. Stranded electrical wire connections. Between the problem in ocean environments where we have water is we have high humidity that lands on the electrical connections and creates electrolysis between the strands. You might have 118 volts on one wire, 119 on another. Well, you might have, you do. It's called the skin effect. As the voltage gets less as it goes to the center of the wire. So as the wire strands come outward, the voltage gets higher and higher. You might have 118 on one strand, and on the next wire, you got 120. And on the next strand, you got 122. You've got varying voltages. The problem is with stranded conductors is if you get any moisture on between the strands, you're setting the scenario for electrolysis to take place. Electrolysis means two voltages of different potential, one at 118, one at 120, and a little bit of electrolyte between the two, which is salty water. And Bob's your uncle. You have set the stage for electrolysis. You'll get what's called galvanic corrosion between the two conductors. And that's where you get this white powder. And white powder creates looseness and creates sparks and everything else. So it says in the code, wherever you have stranded aluminum conductors, you must use antioxidant. Where do we see stranded aluminum conductors? We see it coming from the street into the panel. And that's where we see stranded aluminum conductors. These conductors must have paste to avoid galvanic corrosion. In the code, it does not anywhere say anything about non-stranded conductors, solid conductors, which is aluminum wire branch circuits. That's a solid number 12. It says use correct wire connectors. Again, I tell you that story about the guy who had an apartment building, telling me that he used number 33 wire connectors and paste. Is that acceptable? No, because you got the wrong wire connectors. Now, there is a Thomas and Betts. There's two manufacturers. Thomas and Betts were the founders of electrical wire connectors, coming up with the term Moret back in the 1950s or something. Ideal is their competition, company called Ideal. They make, it's about, I don't know, showing my age, but I'm going to say 10 years. They're probably 20 years old now. They've been making aluminum wire number 65 wire connectors, as you know, rated for aluminum. They use, I hate to say it, but they use steel spring, and it's approved for aluminum. And it's filled, it's a bigger wire connector. It's cheaper than the Thomas and Betts, I believe. And that's why it's popular. And they fill it, I guess it is cheaper because they're using steel springs. And it's rated for 105, not 125. Anyway, they fill it up with goop. So they're doing exactly what the 33s with goop does. But I guess they've figured it out by having bigger size, and they've got the spring so it expands and contracts. They've made it work, and it's an acceptable solution. So in summary, it may work, what you're saying, but unless you have the correct wire connector, it's not to code, and it can melt and cause fire. Does that answer your question?
That's great. We'll do another one from Diane. She says, thank you for all the details and sharing your knowledge. In your professional opinion, how come we can still encounter in our real estate practice buildings of the late 60s to mid 70s having to spend horrendous amounts of money to be imposed by their insurance companies to rewire the entire building rather than pigtailing it?
Oh my God. You know something? I could talk about this. I would love to talk about this. This is the reason we started Power Check. My neighbor, 2 doors up, Ted, was renewing his insurance, and we were out walking our dogs, and dogs happened to connect, and we were chatting. He said, "Brian, I understand you're an electrician." That's how you are with neighbors, right? We're not best friends, but we get to know each other, and great guy. And he said, "Well, my insurance company won't won't insure my house. They want me to rewire my house, get rid of the knob and tube completely. It was knob and tube, but the same thing with aluminum. And I've had a quote from big electrical company, and it's going to cost like close to $30,000. It's a 3-story house. It's about $10,000 a floor typically to replace knob and tube. So 30,000 was pretty correct. And he says, I'd love you to have a second opinion and see if there's anything you can say about it, and or anything, what you think. If that price seemed out of line, it seems very high. And I said, sure, I'll come by, take a look. Well, I took a look at it, and I did my voltage drop check, testing the connections where I was measuring 3 volts end of line, meaning the connections were absolutely sound, which is normal because it's knob and tube with soldered splices. Of course, it's fantastic. It was fantastic. There was nothing wrong with the knob and tube. He did need to put GFIs on those outlets that had been swapped for the 2-prong swap for modern 3-prong, which would have cost him $20 an outlet and a couple of hours with an electrician. So maybe $500 total bill to get GFIs throughout the house on the knob and tube. But he didn't need to spend $30,000. But I went into that basement, and he had a basement suite illegal. And there we had the problem. It was all this stuff that was wrong. And that was what was causing the fire. So it dawned on me just like that. The insurance companies got it wrong. They're taking, and as a matter of fact, this sentence comes from BCAA. I remember the lady with BCAA stood up at a talk we gave, and she says, we've been taking broad strokes to determine risk rather than specific actions. With PowerCheck, we're keening on partnering with PowerCheck because they're going to take specific actions on each specific house as to what needs to be done, rather than our broad sweeping approach. And that's why I started PowerCheck. I put a list together of all the DIY stuff I could see, all the maintenance stuff I could see, like loose connections and debris in boxes, and all the knob and tube voltage checks and aluminum wiring voltage checks that needed to be done. And I put together an 80-point checklist and said, this is what we need to check. And BCA thought it was great and thought it was fantastic. And we put together this program. One of the concerns was, what do we call acceptable? Old standards, new standards, or very new standards? And so I came up with these words. Look, if we find anything that's a non-compliance with code, that's a fire hazard, house is called high risk. Give them 30 days to get it fixed. If it's imminent and there's going to be a fire tomorrow, or there could be, extreme risk, but that's just extra. Medium risk is where we want to get. Medium risk says those few things have been fixed. So every house we go into is literally high risk because we find 1, 2, 3, 10 things that need to be fixed. And change your outlets for your ungrounded outlets for GFIs. All of this stuff. Get rid of the stapled extension cords around the perimeter of the house. All of these things. Aluminum wire. Make sure you've got correct pigtailing with correct wire connectors. It's on the report. You do all of that, it gets you down to medium risk, which means complies with code at time of installation. That's what the safety authority requires, is that codes comply with installation at time of installation. We, PowerCheck, have put together a list of, and I got the list from the Chief Inspector of Victoria, Chief Inspector of Vancouver, and Rick May, Chief Inspector of BC Safety Authority. They kindly gave me their time to give me their suggestions, all three independently. The 3 things that all 3 of them want to see are hardwired, to bring it up to current code, are hardwired smoke alarms, one on each floor with interconnect, complying with the code of 1980, which has been continuous right through. Grounding of the gas pipe and the wastewater stack, which was something I didn't know about, and GFIs in wet locations, outdoors and bathrooms. Do those 3 things, that takes you from what we call medium risk, complies with code at time of installation, to low risk, in quotes, has been brought up to the standards of 2001. A great place. In 2002, the code requires we now put arc fault breakers on all bedroom outlet circuits, which can be prohibitively expensive in an old house with an old panel, because many of the old panels won't take arc fault, which means you're putting in a new service. And, so we say low risk is where, medium risk is where you're required, low risk is where you're recommended. And if you want to put in the arc fault breakers, please go ahead. So, and we've presented this as a solution for the insurance industry. BCAA warmly embraced us, embraced me, embraced the program, and has marketed it for 16 years. It's been a fantastic. A year after I started in 2008, Wawanesa came on board, Westland came on board, Intact came on board, Optimum West came on board, Northbridge through Park Insurance came on board. So now we've got 6 major insurance companies out of the 20 that will accept a power check report rather than having to rewire the house. The 14 other companies, Family, Aviva, Cooperators, Gore, Federated, Economical, blah, 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 Travelers, they don't want to hear from PowerCheck. They got their books, they got their rules, and their rules are written back east, in New York, in Amsterdam, in London, and some little guy in Vancouver saying we got a better way of making a wheel that runs smoother. They don't want to hear about. You say, this is the world we got. We do not insure houses with aluminum wire. Done. Broad sweep. So what I suggest is, if you have been told by your insurance broker, sorry, you're going to have to replace your knob and tube. You're going to have to replace your aluminum wire and spend $30,000. They don't even care about the DIYs or the everything else we're talking about. They just want to know about knob. Those rules have been set in stone for 30 years, and they ain't changing by me or by anybody else. I've even had the representatives from BC attended my talks and say, this is wonderful, Brian. We'll talk to head office back in Toronto. Do you think it makes a difference? No, doesn't change anything. Rewire. So anyway, if you get that request, sorry, well, go to another insurance company. As I mentioned, those 6 major insurance companies, BCAA, Westland, Intact, Wawanesa, Optimum, Northbridge. Those are the 6 that really have been totally supportive of what I'm doing, and it's wonderful. And it's just wonderful. And I really don't know. These guys change their minds on the drop of a hat. They may say tomorrow, sorry, we had a house burned down with knob and tube, no more power check reports, for whatever reason. And it had nothing to do with knob and tube, probably. But, they can change all the time. And it's totally a world insurance. All these insurance companies, there's a fixed market, X number of houses, 1.6 million houses in BC. And they're all fighting for that to take a bigger market share. So they're all approaching things a bit differently to try and, some won't require a power check. Some will say, we'll insure you. Premier Marine, they charge extra. They will not ask if they don't care. They'll insure knob and tube. They'll insure aluminum wire. They'll charge a premium. They don't even require a power check inspection. Why not? Because that's the way they get customers. They charge a little bit extra. Their losses are higher, I guess, but their profits. It's the business. It's competitive business. Anyway, it's the one thing that riles me up, is I wish the insurance industry, would adopt this. It's funny. I had a talk with the boss of BCAA, and I said, how can we build things up? How can we get it so all houses over 50 years built before 1975 get an inspection? And she says, we can't do that. We can't demand that, or we would go out of business overnight. That's what she said. Everybody would go to the competition if we demanded power check inspections. They'd all go to the competition. Doesn't matter if you're telling people what to do to get safe. It says your job, Brian, is to go to every one of those insurance companies, get them to listen to your talks and change the rules. And if we get everybody on board, we can raise the bar together. But we got to bring all 20 companies on board.
Well, that's some good
60
information,
people
Brian.
on board.
Thank you for letting us know.
Sorry?
That's great information. Thank you for letting us know. Before everyone goes, I just want to give them your information so they can reach out to you. So if everyone get your pens ready or your phones, you can find Brian at powercheck.ca for the website. Phone number is 604-684-3630. Or you can email at info@powercheck.ca. And also, if you want to do a quick Google, it will be one of the first companies that come up when you put PowerCheck. Thank you, Brian, for all of your information. This is great. It's nice to see your knowledge and your passion, and we love having you.
It's
And
pretty fun. You know, I can just say one little postscript footnote.
Yep.
I was an electrician since 1971. You know, my first job out of high school, unfortunately, was getting a job as a guy wiring houses instead of going on to university, which I did later. But the electricals always backed me up. But I never dreamed in a million years that I would find something wrong in this world around us that we live in. You know, you think the world is a good place and there's a lot of experts out there who do things right. But the insurance industry, because of this way it works, where they're all fighting for, you know, trying to basically make a profit with minimum losses, they're all taking a different angle. And this broad sweep approach works for the profits of the insurance industry. It works, but it doesn't work for it's not efficient. It doesn't work for the homeowner because it doesn't address risk and it throws the homeowner having to spend a ton of money, very likely unnecessary. And I think it's very rare to find something special in life that can be really, really improved. Me, just an electrician, you know, recognizing the obvious, that where the problems really were. And yet, you know, and that's where PowerCheck came up to as a solution. But I think it's just quite extraordinary from a bird's eye perspective that there's something that really is wrong with the way insurance industry is working. And it works that way. It's not wrong. It just is, it's developed that way because of, you know, competition, all trying to get a bigger market share at minimum losses. But through critical analysis, if insurance companies can take critical analysis, as we're doing in these older houses, everybody wins. So
well, thank you so much, Ryan. You're the best. And we're getting a lot of positive comments in the back end that they really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you once again.
thank you,
And we'll
guys.
definitely have you back.
Okay, it's great to be here. Thank you, Dinesh, for everything.
You're very welcome, and everyone have a great long weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.